Hello and welcome to the France 24 interview. I'm Leela Jacinto. This is not a very good time to stage a demonstration in Russia if you don't have the right permits. A new law that was signed in by Russian President Vladimir Putin slaps a hefty $9,000 fine on an individual for participating in an unsanctioned demonstration. This is not a very good time to be an investigative reporter in Russia. Since 2000, there have been at least 20 work-related murders of journalists in Russia. So is this a good time to be a human rights activist on Russia? Joining me to answer this question, and several more, is a very courageous, award-winning human rights activist, Tanya Lokshina.
Hello.
Hi. Tanya is the senior Russia researcher at Human Rights Watch, and she's joining us in Paris today. Thank you for joining us. It's good to have you with us.
Not at all. It's my pleasure.
So tell me, Vladimir Putin has returned to the presidency. Now, you've been following Russia for quite a while now. What does this spell for Russia's democratic and human rights record?
Well, this is definitely not good news as far as human rights and democracy in Russia are concerned. But at the same time, for someone who works on Russia and for someone who is based in Russia, the situation nowadays is extremely fascinating because for the first time in many years, what you can't see in the streets of Moscow, the capital of the Russian Federation, are massive public protests.
Despite the new law?
Despite the new law. Well, in fact, last time there was a big public protest just about a week ago, when about 50,000 people, even more than that, gathered peacefully in central Moscow to protest against Mr. Putin and his policies. They were especially careful about not stepping on the grass when they were marching down the boulevard, because they actually knew for a fact that if they step on the grass, then the authorities can actually pretend that they damaged public infrastructure, and then the organizers of the demonstration would pay those horrible fines that you've been referring to. So basically, what happened is that back in September last year, before the elections,
the presidential elections,
before the parliamentary elections that were closely followed by presidential elections in March this year, the then president, Mr. Medvedev, who is now prime minister, and the then prime minister, Mr. Putin, who is now president, made a huge mistake. They came forth with a statement saying, you know what, we are just going to swap. We are going to switch places. So I'm now president, I'm going to be prime minister. I'm now prime minister, I'm going to be president. And guess what? It's not like we just thought it up. We actually planned it 4 years ago when Medvedev was just becoming president. And that, I guess, was simply too much for Russia's population to take. Apathetic or not, people started saying, wait a second, our voice doesn't matter at all. Our opinion doesn't count at all. And that's really what triggered those protests that the Kremlin is so unhappy about. Now, in order to keep the good face on the international arena on the one hand, and in order not to antagonize the protesters, which appeared to be a very serious force, the Kremlin on the one hand allows those massive rallies to take place mostly without major police interference. But at the same time, the restrictions relevant to the organization of public rallies, like what you can't do and what you cannot do, are becoming tougher and tougher and tougher. So nowadays, for example, with the new law, local authorities can make a sort of a blacklist of places in their locality, in the city, where demonstrations should not be conducted, full stop.
So strategic locations can be on this list?
Yes, strategic locations. There's locations that are particularly favored by the opposition, that are very central, that attract a lot of attention, can't be simply put on that particular list. And there you are. The fines, as you have noted, have been increased many times over, to the point when they actually became unaffordable. And there are other restrictions which are so tough that they appear to represent insurmountable obstacles for those Russians who want to implement their fundamental right to free assembly. Also, what the Kremlin is doing is harassing its critics. While those protests are happening and Mr. Putin is able to say, well, so what's the problem? You can see there's thousands and thousands of people in the streets of Moscow, so it's a free and democratic country. In fact, houses of opposition leaders are being searched. The apartments of their close relatives are being raided. Their computers, papers are being confiscated. They are being interrogated precisely on the day when they're supposed to participate and speak at major demonstrations.
Right.
So you have the process happening on the one hand, but at the same time, harassment is being increased, and life of those who oppose Putin's policies, who want Russia to be a democratic, human rights-oriented state, is made really tough.
Right. You know, I just want to, because we don't have that much time and so much to cover, I just want to quickly turn our attention on Syria and the Moscow's continuing support for the Syrian regime. Now, at Human Rights Watch, you have issued a warning, a campaign to a state-owned arms trading company, warning that it could be complicit in crimes against humanity against the Syrian people. I'm wondering what has been the response to that campaign, and being in the human rights community in Russia, what's the sense that you get to Moscow supporting Syria, sorry?
Well, as you know, I do not work on Syria personally, but from what I can see from the extensive reporting by my colleagues, including from the information which was gathered directly in Syria, in the field, there is indeed sufficient evidence to argue that the Syrian authorities may be committing crimes against humanity. And as we know, Russia is the main weapon supplier, is the main arms supplier as far as Syria is concerned. And those arms that are supplied by Russia to Syria are supplied through this one state-owned company. So we are basically warning the company that it might be complicit.
How did they respond? Have you got any response?
Well, we have not. Even though before publicizing that appeal to the company, we actually wrote a private letter, sent it to them well in advance, seeking their response, and we actually wanted to have a genuine conversation with them first. We wanted to know whether our information about those arms shipments is correct, for example, whether they are willing to reconsider in any way
but they didn't get back
supplies to Syria. Well, they told us that not being a state institution, but rather a company, they did not have to reply to us. State institutions do have to do that by law, but companies don't.
Gotcha.
And they referred us to the foreign ministry.
I see.
And the foreign ministry has not replied to us so far with regard to those particular questions.
Gotcha.
But it really does seem from official statements by Russian leadership, including by the foreign minister, Mr. Lavrov, that Russia is not going to reconsider arms supply to Syria, most unfortunately, despite all the legitimate warnings from human rights organizations, not only Human Rights Watch, but all the leading international human rights groups.
Right. I want to turn our attention to the North Caucasus, to Chechnya. You have been monitoring this very closely. You've written 2 books on it. We don't hear that so much about Chechnya anymore. Is this because the situation is improving?
The reason why you don't hear that much about Chechnya is that people are too frightened to talk. That's possibly the most important thing to know about Chechnya today. The Chechen Republic, even though formally a part of the Russian Federation, that's what there was a war about, right? In fact exists as a state within a state, completely outside Russia's legal framework. And the only laws that are applicable in Chechnya today are those dictated by Ramzan Kadyrov, the leader of the republic, who was appointed directly by the Kremlin.
So Chechens can't go to a Russian court of law?
Well, technically speaking, those courts that operate in Chechnya, they are Russian courts, as Chechnya is part of the Russian Federation. But if you want to complain to a Chechen court about your relative being abducted and disappeared, it's not like you're going to find justice.
And are these disappearances still happening?
Disappearances still continue, and they're heavily underreported precisely because people are just too afraid to talk. They are afraid of retribution, because you see what happens if there is a family and someone disappears and the family starts complaining, then law enforcement officials come to them and put pressure on them and actually tell them to keep things quiet. And sometimes it reaches the level of threats along the lines of, well, if you want your second son to disappear, try and complain again. Wow. Sometimes it's about other family members being detained and being beaten and being tortured. And so the family is basically forced to stop complaining.
This is not a very optimistic note to end on, but I'm afraid that's really all we have time for. But thank you so much for joining us today. That's it for this edition of the France 24 interview. Stay with us. We have a news coming up.